Welcome to today's webinar, The Essential Value of Street Trees in City Making and Sustainable Urban Design, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in association with the Smart Growth Network. My name is Michael Bayer. I'm the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network, supported by the U.S. EPA's Office of Community Revitalization and managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website at smartgrowth.org that provides information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. The Clearinghouse provides information to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is also the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning topics available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. You can also find out about planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. We are recording this webinar and will be posting it on our website under the Webinar Archives tab. We encourage you to visit the website and to subscribe to our e-newsletter to learn about our upcoming programs. The views expressed by the speakers in this webinar are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the Maryland Department of Planning or the state of Maryland. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association, as well as 1.5 CNUA CEU self-reported credits from the Congress for the New Urbanism. To log your AICP credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, which is The Essential Value of Street Trees in City Making and Sustainable Urban Design. You can also search for event number 9258313. So today our speakers are Victor Dover and Dan Burden. John Paul Weesner of Kittleson Associates is ill today, unfortunately, and cannot join us. We hope JP feels better soon. Victor Dover is principal in charge at Dover Cole & Partners in Florida, where he is nationally recognized as an innovator in city planning, neighborhood design, and street design. Victor lectures widely around the world on the topics of livable communities and sustainable development and has served as national chair of the Congress for the New Urbanism. He co-authored with John Massengale Street Design, The Secret to Great Cities and Towns in 2014. Victor has been awarded the John Nolan Medal for contributions to urbanism, and he's a fellow of both the American Institute of Certified Planners and the Congress for the New Urbanism. He's also an adjunct faculty member at the University of Miami. Victor serves as president of the Parks Foundation of Miami-Dade and is a board member of the National Recreation and Parks Association. We also welcome back Dan Burden, who is the Director of Innovation and Inspiration for Blue Zones LLC, where he's a nationally recognized expert on active transportation, livable and sustainable communities, complete streets, safe routes to school enhancements, and bicycle and pedestrian facilities and programs. By inspiring residents, policymakers, planners, and designers to change their built environments to accommodate people, Dan has helped more than 3,800 communities during his more than 40 years of work in the built environment. In 2018, Planet Edison named him as one of the 100 most influential urbanists of all time. He has earned 2 Lifetime Achievement Awards from the American Association of Pedestrians and Bicycle Professionals and from the New Partners for Smart Growth. The League of American Bicyclists named Dan one of the 25 most significant leaders in bicycling for the past 100 years. Following their presentations, our presenters will answer as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question anytime by using the questions tool located in the control panel on the right side of your screen. And as usual, we are going to start with a couple of polls today. The first one, which we're about to launch, we'll just ask where you are today, living and working. And if you have any difficulty in responding to this, you may need to exit from full screen mode. And we'll give everybody about maybe a minute, a little less, to respond to the question. And then we'll share that and then go to our second one. And thanks to everybody who is with us today. We're excited to have Dan Burden back and also working with Victor. I'll give you a few more seconds to respond. As always, the geographic distribution of the audience varies a little bit from program to program, so we like to show this for you. You can see who's here today. So about a third, 33% of the audience says they're in the Mid-Atlantic or Northeast, 26% in the South, 17% West, 16% Midwest, and then 9% international, including Canada and Mexico. Our second question here is, what am I? Am I an elected government official, a planner, landscape architect, an advocate, an engineer? And if you're not one of those, you can respond in the questions and we'll take a look at those as well. We don't have an other category today, so you do need to select one if you want. Again, we'll give everybody a few seconds to respond to this. And thanks to everybody who is filling this out. It's always interesting again to see who is with us. Okay, so from this, 69% of the audience is their planners, 14% advocates, 10% landscape architect, 6% engineer, and 1% elected government official. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Victor Dover. Welcome, Victor.
Well, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to this. Let me show my screen and I'll bring my pictures up. I want to say I'm delighted to see so many of the attendees are planners. We think of design as central to the subject matter planners should cover. So that is not something to add on at the end after all the big decisions are made, but rather something to think about the entire time in the planning process. You know, I want to say in urban design, we're really first and foremost, we're in the before and after business. If you think about what we start with in streets, we are attempting to make them into better addresses than they were. We're often starting with a place that had a short-term, useful economic lifetime. We want to get to a place that has more endurance, you know, a place where it really wants to be. So what we're doing is we're helping communities figure out what they want to be when they grow up. So hopefully they change the places that they know into the ones they really want to have that are more likely to endure. It won't surprise you at all to hear that street trees are a big part of that. As part of that work, we find ourselves, after many decades, really kind of concluding that street design is the one thing that communities can least afford to get wrong, and yet it's the one thing most often gotten wrong. And so John Massengale and I wrote this big, thick textbook about street design to try and get into that gap. And we researched the contents of the book over a several-year-long period. It took like 3.5 years to make the book. And so we ended up pouring over 18,000 photographs and drawings and measurements to eventually produce the book. Along the way, we've ended up with the subtitle, The Secret to Great Cities and Towns. Of course, street trees are a big part of the book. So I'll give you a little bit of idea about that. We arrived at 3 really simple conclusions. First, the design of cities begins with streets. And second, the best streets are the ones that are more than just ways to get from here to there or places to put your mailbox. They are places where people want to be. So that's what I mean by becoming great addresses. And then third, that street trees are one crucial component of many, many of those streets. Not the only component, but one we care about a lot, one that's pretty darn crucial. So how crucial? Well, landscape architect Henry Arnold, who wrote this wonderful book called Trees in Urban Design, once said, trees are 50% of urban design. And it shows a beautiful photograph for the cover of that book that kind of typifies this idea. The places where people want to be, often turn out to be the places that have street trees. And we'll explore that in this session. The places where people want to be have street trees because these give a kind of order to the public realm. They help shape the street spaces into legible rooms for which the tree canopy often forms a soft green ceiling. Now, if you just go by the usual crude measurements of planning and zoning and future land use, when we compare good places to bad ones, our goal, of course, is to learn what to imitate and what to avoid. So naturally, we look at a lot of different details. This includes the building to street relationship. It includes the architecture and much more. And those things all have to be right. We also see that the places which statistically on paper seem identical aren't really identical at all. Here are two scenes for comparison. They weigh in at the same land use, the same density, the same lot size, and so on. But they are so profoundly different. I'll just toggle back and forth a little bit between them. The difference between these two places is design. The line of street trees that is seen on the more attractive picture, even seen here when they were very young, is a crucial part of that design difference. So as urbanists, we have to look at human settlements through many different lenses and think of a lot of factors at one time. This applies to street trees too. So you can wear the glasses of an economist or an investor, or the glasses of a biologist, or the lenses, who might be seeking the most productive habitats, or the eyes of an engineer, making sure it all works. You can look at the technicalities in an engineering sense, or you can look at values added economically or in public health. There are a lot of things to think about what makes a successful town. And a town needs all of these. But there's one set of lenses in particular that we also need, and that's the lens of the civic artist. And thinking of planning as the civic art, we consider the city a great collective work of art that's never really finished. And what we're seeking to do is use geometry and design to make the city mean something to people when they experience it. And today, all real estate consists of selling better experiences. And this is where the art lens becomes indispensable. So that's really my subject today. Dan is going to cover the many values that are furthered by good street trees, and we'll share some little known secrets about how to succeed with the details in your streets. But I want to start us off by sharing examples and talking about some of the ways we use geometry to get street trees that have a lot of impact. So first off, all to remember that street design has always been a hallmark of advanced civilizations. You can go back to Rome and to the Appian Way, and you'll see, the reason the Roman Empire was successful is because they standardized a few things. And they, of course, were moving armies and moving merchandise and moving ideas at a time when transportation and communication were really synonyms. Think about that for a second. Well, we still send messages along streets. All along the timeline, humans have been testing many configurations and have developed a lot of habits for planting trees along the streets, habits that only recently started to be against the rule books. And as we go, we'll talk about that a little bit. Like the tree that's close to the corner, that probably there's a rule that says, hey, hang on a minute here, that tree can't be that close. And I guess I also want you to remember that there are a lot of ways to grow trees. Trees that make the place, they seem as crucial as the buildings and the gardens, but those trees often love to defy the assumptions that are in all our manuals, that we were taught were best practices about what you can and cannot do. And this is a street in Charleston, which has some street trees planted that come right up out of the asphalt. And of course, wreak havoc with the sidewalks and so on. But it would be unthinkable to have this great street, Legree Street in Charleston, without that. So let me first be emphatic. Street trees, yes. Trees are like a magic superpower in street design. When you line them up, something really forceful happens. They cut the glare, they make it prettier, but mostly they send a message, the message that here someone cares. So I want to show you a picture of a neighborhood that we designed in Davidson, North Carolina. I had a memorable conversation with a senior citizen lady who lives in the neighborhood. This is called St. Albans. She was walking down the sidewalk when I was there to take some pictures. And you can see her here in the green sweater. And she pointed to those street trees as we were talking, and she said, "Those trees are my lifeline." And of course, I was intrigued. I leaned in and said, "Well, what do you mean?" And she said, "Well, because of them, I get out of my house and I walk around. I walk around the block, or I walk down to my friends, and I get my daily walk. If they weren't there, I'd be forced to stay inside." And the conversation really stayed with me after that. It was more than just making it prettier. It was a lifeline for her. And it sent a message to her that someone cares about her. The message that somebody cares about this place can be seen in all kinds of street scenes that feature street trees. The famous revitalization success story in Greenville, South Carolina. The trees are like a medium for sending the message. Now, Dan is going to cover this, but I just want to say there are a whole lot of reasons to love those trees, not just one or two, and Dan will cover a lot of them. I'll touch on a few of them and Dan will elaborate. But here's my favorite. Those trees, they make oxygen. We breathe that stuff. A tree can absorb 48 pounds of carbon dioxide in a year. One large tree can produce enough oxygen for a couple of people. So there's no way to underestimate how crucial this is. It's been famously said that the green parts, the streets with their tree lines, the parks and public spaces are like the lungs of a city. And it is literally true when we think about they take in our CO2 and they give us what we need in oxygen. More on this coming up from Dan, who will talk more about the public health impacts of all this. Now, we live in a very special time, a perilous time in which people are suspicious of growth and change and, planning. And I have to say that I think that North Americans in particular are conditioned to be suspicious of change by all the built evidence around us. And so really our job is to start restoring confidence in the idea of growth and change. If we could get back to the point where people expect that growth and change can make things better instead of worse, we'll do a lot of good. First, we'll make it possible to solve our multiple crises. The carbon crisis depends on learning to live in a more energy efficient and more compact way, just to name one. Then there's the housing crisis. So more and more. Now, along the way, it eventually became clear we were going to need to do an update to the street design book. So I'm excited to say John Massengale and I and our team are writing a new version. It's going to be different from the original, and I'll talk about some of the reasons why. But it's in full color in this second edition, and it'll have a number of new things to say and show about street trees. As we've been preparing it, we've gone back to challenge some of our original assumptions. And we've worked to include some new examples, things that were built after we published the first edition of the book, like Clematis Street in West Palm Beach, for example. Big part of that project was bringing more green onto the street and getting a better balance between the amount of the space from building face to building face that's devoted to the cars that are being stored and on-street parking or are moving, and the amount of space has been devoted to people stuff, including the landscape, dining, places to sit, and places to walk. So we'll show the Clematis Street in the book. In the new format for the book, we've got more room, so we can show more vividly a compendium of many street types. We've added to the number of types that are illustrated and how they work. And along the way, we'll be able to show how their street trees work. Like the first edition, it'll include some of the wide classic boulevards and avenues, which we need to learn how to do them again as human civilizations. We still need them, and we need to be better at making them. And that means in part reconnecting to multimodalism, reconnecting to the tree canopy. But we'll also be including some additional street types, like the canal streets, for example, that will undoubtedly need an adaptation to sea level rise in many of our coastal areas. So we've begun building these illustrations, and it's caused us to go back and say, well, what is the really right dimension for this? How frequently do we need these elements to repeat? And what would we want to be sure to show as the most crucial components? The illustrations are a lot larger, and so they're going to invite your scrutiny. I'm sure I'll get a lot of attention in my email inbox from people who are questioning each little detail of them, because you'll be able to see them more carefully. But that's the whole idea, because we want people to have that conversation and move into a new level of state of the art. Now, while we challenge some assumptions, the continuing research has also reinforced our conviction about the importance of walkable tree-lined streets. You consider Ion in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. It doesn't look like it's neighboring subdivisions because the buildings are a little closer together, the buildings are a little set forward, and of course, unlike the sprawl in Greater Mount Pleasant, there has real street-like streets with real street trees, and you can see that in the pictures. But the land uses in Ion, while they're not different from the adjoining subdivisions, the design difference is big, and you can see the difference that this design difference has made evident in a map like this. In this map by Joe Minicosi, the taller spikes reflect greater real estate value. Now, if Ion is shown there in the middle of your screen with the yellow oval around it. If you're the city manager, or you're the mayor, or you're the school superintendent, and you've got to replace the roof on your public building, or run a Parks and Recreation department, or put some new tires on a school bus, or do 100 other things you need to do while balancing the budget, you need some of these spikes. So we need to know how that's done. And of course, that design difference does in fact work. It works for the investors. It's worth the trouble. And I think it's clear to anyone who travels to historic places that people knew this 150 years ago. And well, they forgot. Vince Graham and Bob Turner, who pioneered the revival of neighborhoods with front porches and street trees in the low country of South Carolina, found themselves a cover story on the cover of the Wall Street Journal. And the headline was kind of amazing when you look back on it. Just look at that headline for a second. It says, "Developers discover old values can bring astonishing returns." They got rewarded in a meaningful way for just doing what used to be good habits of someone making a new neighborhood or modifying an existing ones. Once you learn to see street spaces and the role that their trees play in them, you really can't ever unsee it. And so I hope that showing you a lot of visual examples is stimulating to go out and look with that set of lenses. It's also possible to generate enormous variety with tree-lined streets. And here's a Spanish colonial street in which the street trees and the bulk of the walking space are in the center of the street, and most of the car stuff is on the outer flank of the street. So the variety that's possible is immense. I'm describing street trees as part of how we tell our story. Who we are. They're like a medium for sending messages. They tell us and they show what we care about, and they help us know instinctively when we gaze out on the sidewalk or over our handlebars or over the steering wheel. They tell us where we are. And when we are, they show us that's, this is what we see when we think of the seasons. And so I want to switch now to just talking about some of the fundamental geometries that we can use. The first, most basic, staple, most typical and reliable tool is the tree line. An example from the south of France, in which this is a 19th century road widening project. But the engineers and public works officials in the past, when they undid the tangled medieval street network here and lined things up, they created a postcard picture of the town. It would be unthinkable to try to achieve that in that setting without the street trees. Robert Stern famously said, and we talk about this a little bit in the street design book, that the first rule of design is line things up. And that's what John Nolan did. John Nolan was the first American to call himself a professional city planner when he ordered these trees to be planted in rows parallel to the curbs. He gave all of us who visit there, that street, Queens Road in Myers Park, this amazing gift where, the gift is that you get this sense of moving through a climax forest. It's like walking down the nave of a Gothic cathedral. Just a remarkable thing. And all because he said, let's plant these trees. They'll pay dividends in time. Now, the garden suburb in the golden age of the suburbs drew on this simple time-tested pattern. In Myers Park or in Coral Gables, in Beverly Hills, and 1,000 other golden age of the suburbs places from the era. The simple time-tested pattern, line things up. Now, whenever I show these pictures, I'm always expecting at around this time in the presentation, somebody will say, but Victor, we're not Coral Gables. And what I will say to you is, well, Coral Gables wasn't always Coral Gables. If you look at the historic photographs, you can see the tiny little trees that when they were first planted and the first few buildings and the sort of vast openness of the still vacant lots. And so Coral Gables wasn't Coral Gables to start with. Somebody went up in the water tower and shot this picture. And then I had somebody go back in 2015 or 2018 and take that same picture from that same angle to show you the difference. Yeah, so the reason a place like Coral Gables has this amazing tree canopy, and in particular its street tree canopy, is because somebody bothered to line things up, plant trees in a row, and help them grow. And that's what we see when you look at the difference between the historic picture of Coral Gables and the contemporary one. So of course, the right time to plant a street tree was 10 years ago, and the second best time is right now. Seems to be getting a little bit of a lag. So if somebody break in and tell me if you're not getting the pictures that I'm talking about. The Coral Gables wasn't always Coral Gables. In classic formal design, the tree line is arranged like columns in architecture. And the effect of this is to just divide very large spaces, even the big wide streets, into ensembles of smaller, more comfortable spaces. And in a way, what happens is the street trees extend this kind of green weave into the city from the adjoining parks and squares. So there's a combination of the tree-lined street with the other green spaces of the city, what I'm calling collectively the green parts. That's really central. So when we design a new neighborhood, we're trying to incorporate these lessons. I will tell you that I admonish the young folks in our office always as we're doing this work, we don't try to add these green parts at the end after all the big decisions have already been made. We start with the green parts. And just to give you an illustration of why I think that's crucial. Well, we have a lot in this country, especially a lot of vast urban spaces that need reclaiming. the dead strip shopping centers and the dying shopping malls that need to be reclaimed and rethought. We have, in a post-industrial society, we have a lot of lost space formerly devoted to industry that will need to find new purposes. Here's one in Chattanooga. So as we go to reclaim these spaces and grow the first 21st century car optional neighborhoods, we'll need all of these tools. And the street trees are just one, but they're pretty darn important. So this is the before and after that illustrates the reclaiming of the waterfront, the remaking of a site where for 150 years, the folks in Chattanooga were kind of cut off from their riverfront. And as a result of the redevelopment at the bend, they will get a chance to reconnect with all that. And of course, it's a neighborhood, so it has blocks and streets, and the streets are tree-lined streets. Now, on my preview, John and Dan, it's not quite keeping up. So if you need to break in and tell me that.
Nope. It's ahead of your preview. We're seeing exactly what you're doing.
Very good. No, there are lots of things to manage, including like keeping the block small and insisting on street-oriented architecture. But starting with the green parts is the way. So in the bend, for example, we designed some park blocks and streets with have special street tree planting programs to extend the green of the waterfront along the river into the neighborhood. So these are all scenes from the bend in Chattanooga. Starting with the green parts means laying out the public spaces first. That may sound a little backwards, but it means starting with the green tree line streets and then working our way toward the other stuff everybody's waiting on, like where's the leasable and sellable real estate and how much of it do you have? But we realized that starting with the green parts is really just employing the techniques that the old masters knew. You know, they said create great addresses. And so that's what we are setting out to do. And the tree line is a pretty amazing thing, actually. If you think about it, as we go now further in the Complete Streets 2.0 era, we can use the tree lines to make our new protected and separated bike infrastructure, for example, safer and more pleasant. And Complete Streets 2.0, or maybe we're on 3.0, really means that we need completer streets. For example, if it's not yet a beautiful street, it's not a complete street, no matter how much green paint we put down. So the street tree is obviously a pretty important part of that. The tree line is one way you just take it up a notch. This is Paris. Paris has this handy accessory at the end of some of the key streets, the Arc de Triomphe. Pretty useful tool for getting you to love your streets. But what we're really trying to do is elevate the street into something more than just a collection of land uses and parking lots. John Massengale, my co-author, dubbed the Avenue Diana the most beautiful parking lot in the world. Of course, that's a joke because it does supply a ton of parking, but the world's most beautiful parking lot isn't a parking lot at all. It's a street with the superpower of street trees. Last thing about tree lines, it sounds easy enough to line things up. It should be, but in every town we visit, there are old habits arrayed against this simple solution. You have to fight for them. They're kind of worth the effort. Speaking of the before and after business, when we did this street in South Miami years ago, which went from being kind of the most desolate of side streets to the social center of the neighborhood, of course, because we planted trees, there was a fateful moment during construction when one of my colleagues here at the office came running up the stairs and said, I just met the public works director out in the street and they said they found an 8-inch water main they didn't know was there. And so no street trees. It wasn't in the budget to move that pipe. So they're just gonna have to cut the street trees out of the program. And I went running back down the stairs and said, hell no. We'll adjust the design. Let's move the alignment. Let's offset the streets. Let's adjust it so we can leave the pipe where it is and plant the trees anyway. Just move it over a little bit. That's exactly what we did, and it was worth every bit of the extra effort. Let's talk about LAs. I know, funny French words. These old masters of landscape design that I've been talking about had another secret weapon, and that is paired tree lines. If you put together parallel rows of trees, you form an LA. Dan's heard me tell the story about how it was 5 o'clock in the afternoon when I shot this picture in Stockholm. It was very cold, and I saw this beautiful urban trail, multi-use path, set up with an alley of trees alongside one of its most important streets. And I saw the cyclist in the distance, and so I took a knee and I waited for him to get in just the right spot to take my picture. And I realized as he got closer to me, he was whistling. He was clearly bundled up on his way home from work, and he was having the time of his life. In other words, his commute at the end of a hard workday was one of the joyful experiences of his day. How many of us can say that in North America? Not enough of us. But that was happening because somebody took the trouble to draw 2 lines on a map and line things up and plant those trees in a row and form an LA. So the thing about an LA is the 2 tree lines converge in perspective in the distance. And that gives you kind of this sense of movement and scale. The ancients used this on the Avenue of the Emperors. Olmsted used this in his great parkways and boulevards. More on that in a sec. People want to be where this kind of human creativity is on display. There's a hat tip to Jonathan Colby in Atlanta for spotting this extraordinary example on the left, where the alley is like an A-frame and the trees are employed and carefully grown in the city as an artwork. So, or think about how the paired trees on either side of the Rambla in Barcelona exemplify the idea of a visit-worthy destination. It's the alley that delivers that. Closer to home and simpler, here's Missoula. We just have shallow front yards in the close-in neighborhoods in downtown Missoula, Montana, and there are the street trees on the left, and then there's a second row of trees in the front yards that are paired up with those, and that means the sidewalk space is framed like an alley. So you walk down that sidewalk, you feel like somebody important. Again, the street is sending you a message that somebody cares. We've been exploring a special variation on this. Here's a new street proposed to be built in Rogers, Arkansas. The usual 2 lines of trees are joined by a 3rd line. The reason for doing this is pretty simple. There's a wonderful trail in Northwest Arkansas called the Razorback Greenway, and this street connects to it. So from this neighborhood, this will be the direct route. And so the idea is that this extension of the regional trail system that will cross across this neighborhood can be framed by the trees on both sides, just like you saw in Missoula in the form of an LA. So yeah, street trees are great, and having more of them is even greater. I will say, though, that asymmetrical streets also have a proud history. If you strategically place the tree lines and LAs, you can end up getting shade where it's needed. And you can also allow the winter sun to reach where it's needed to clear the snow or ice on the sidewalk or warm the buildings in the winter. So there's a lot to be said for asymmetrical solutions where street trees are concerned. Now, the third tool is a special thing. It's the tree-lined grand avenues that serve to link neighborhoods or parks across the city. This is Lincoln Parkway in Buffalo, where Olmsted designed several parks. They brought him to town and said, which of these several sites do you think should be our great central park, our answer to Prospect Park in Brooklyn? And he said, you should make all of them into parks, and then you should let me connect them all with these beautiful boulevards and avenues. And so the idea was that the parks would be linked together in a green system by streets like this one. So think of the links as the greenest streets in town, like Commonwealth Avenue in Boston. They're direct routes, generally speaking. They are the natural places to form these links. They help you get across the city in a direct way, but they also make the city legible to us. And so as we look back into that great textbook that is our history, you can see this over and over. St. Charles Avenue in New Orleans was laid out, and at the time it could have been just a mere transportation facility. Obviously, the St. Charles streetcar famously goes down St. Charles Avenue. But the tree-lined link made it into a lot more. It's a great address. It's like the picture postcard of this part of town. And there are times when you can find it full of runners and cyclists. So it's a wellness facility too. And it's a flyway for birds and pollinators and just on and on and on. I do love me a skinny street. I guess, we've been showing a lot of tight and compact urban environments, and we do love skinny streets. But when the big, busy streets that are wide by necessity are conceived as these links with the street trees, they can be good neighbors instead of a blight, and they can add to the quality of life instead of taking it away. We're always looking at ways to retrofit suburbia and question the assumptions for a new century. And one of the big east-west streets in Miami, the scene of a really sad day when a so-called pedestrian bridge under construction fell, and several people died in that disaster. Of course, they were building it in a rushed way, that bridge, because they had to get traffic back open quickly. So all their priority was really on traffic. The message that they sent with the so-called pedestrian bridge was, we're going to give you a place every few miles where you can go up into the air and get out of our way, you pesky pedestrians, so we can keep the traffic moving down below. But if you think about it, if the real purpose was to move people back and forth perpendicular to the bridge in the long direction here, it could have been done a number of other ways. And there's plenty of right-of-way in which to do it. For example, rethinking some of those lanes for bus rapid transit, and rethinking some of that space for the walking and biking connections. That would be very natural to make it grade. And so at that point, there wouldn't be any real need or want to have you go up in the sky as a person walking or a person walking who's pushing a bike. And of course, we don't know whether such a future facility would be done with rubber tires or if it will be done with rails. But we do know if people want to go back and forth, but they also want a great city, we're going to need to use some of that space they're using for car lanes now in other ways, like planting street trees and supporting transit. That's a lot more efficient. All right, the last of the geometry admonitions for me is about the single tree, and in particular, the lean-in tree. I just don't want you to ever underestimate the power of a single tree. I've been talking about groups and lines of trees and pairs of trees, but don't underestimate the power of a single one. This one tree in historic Micanopy, indispensable. Or consider this one that leans in from the adjacent garden and extends over Turrell Street in Oxford. The single lean-in tree is a great tool in the street tree lovers toolkit. Traditional villages often get their dose of trees in the street from the lean-in tree. It's not a new idea. We learned about it from the pictures Raymond Unwin included in his 1909 book called Town Planning in Practice, and are attempting to incorporate that. You can see the lean-in tree here in Pacific Grove, California. So that's it. If we're making a list of what you need to grow a car optional neighborhood of the 21st century, the most important things you'll need is to plant street trees and then plant some more. It's not the only thing on our to-do list, but it's the low-tech, time-tested, affordable core thing to do. So now I guess we'll turn it over to Dan and hear from Dan about the many other differences street trees can make and about how to get it right. Thank you very much.
Dan is unmuted and trying to get the PowerPoint started.
I hope it's working. I'm clicking the button. John, help me. Do I hit where it says show main screen?
Yeah, you want to go under sharing and then click show screen.
Okay. Is it up now? Yeah.
Kind of. We're seeing your slide sorter. We're not seeing the slideshow, but yeah, you're sharing right now.
All right.
Way to go.
Hopefully, we're now looking at my presentation. What a beautiful stage Victor set for us. I'd like to add now some specifics on the active transportation side and how vital the street tree is if we're going to get the speeds right, people walking, and bring back the social life of streets. And obviously all the many benefits to mitigate for the amount of pavement that's out there, and see what our road to recovery is going to be. So with that, let me start with the section on what walkability and the street parts are and how important they become. And I want to do that with some before and after contrast. For example, if we're going to have children walk to school safely, this type of street, just nothing but pure asphalt, is not only ugly, it invites speed. But if we were to now take the parts of the street and designate those elements that bring back the desire to be in a place, to separate the modes appropriately, to create the buffers, all the edges and everything, and the green, then it would look much more like this as opposed to what we see in the previous scene. So I'm going to now go in and talk about the parts and the elements that give us that. But I want to further set the stage by pointing out that how long we live, how well we live, is really dependent on us building the environment where people do want to walk, do want to bike, and do have choices other than just jumping in the car and adding to the morass of pavement from parking lots and very wide streets. And so truly, we're in charge of about 70 on up to as much as 80% of how long we live and how healthy we are. That's the concept behind the Blue Zones organization, which I'm part of. And I want to also point out that there's been a fair amount of research. We need more, but there's plenty of research that details people's willingness to walk, that they're more likely to walk where they feel comfortable, where the environment is pedestrian friendly. It's just absolutely true. Of the many communities I've worked in, that's what I see, that people throng to those areas most green and where traffic speeds are under control, as we see, and this one is Davis, California. Notice the edge, the buffers, and how comfortable a person feels, plus the benefit of the shade. I'm going to also talk a little bit about the social aspects. Although this isn't the street, it's a area that we might say was recovered or just new to be protected from trying to apply it to keeping people in motion. People need places to gather, and notice the value, the importance of this single tree to set that stage as part of just a really well constructed area that's being watched over by apartments and other units. The other big element, and I'll get into this a little more depth later in the presentation, is you can take a concept street, say it's a boulevard, or wants to be a boulevard. In the above street, speeds are typically in the high 40s and the low 50s, even higher. But it's only tasked to move about 18,000 cars a day. That could be done in even 2 lanes with the right intersections. But the below street, which is moving over 40,000 cars a day, does it with a much better control of speeds, plus bringing the green and all the other elements that are needed. So it hasn't been said often enough, and the engineering community too often has tried to move trees back behind sidewalks, saying that the trees produce a far greater danger to the motorist. They don't. The motorist, the worst thing I can imagine a motorist doing in life would be to take out the life of another. The trees, once a person's in the steel cage, belted in, and airbags and so on, the trees offer a way to save the motorist from a horrendous event, but they protect the pedestrian and any other off-road type of crash. So I think this is an important concept. There are different ways to create shade. Pete Seckler has created this wonderful illustration for us where we put the buildings and with their proximity to the sidewalks and the street, obviously very important. The use of canopies, and then even umbrellas for more specific shade. But notice the trees are central to this. If you took out the trees and only had the other elements, it just wouldn't feel right. It wouldn't have the right level of shade, nor would it have the right level of invite. Pretty late in my career, I discovered Kevin Lynch's great work, The Image of the City. And if there's to be a recommended reading beyond Victor's great book, I would say that this is a baseline reading. But what I'm going to do is focus in on the paths and the edges of Kevin Lynch's work. These are the areas that define a path. It could be a sidewalk, a street, a transit line, rail, whatever. But the point is that you need the edges to be there as well. I will cover nodes a little bit, but I think it's important to show that the trees are a critical part of this. Perhaps to illustrate that, we can take a road that in modern engineering guides would say this is all you need. Well, it's not. And again, the edge. Look at the value of the street trees and the in this case some additional green to setting the place. They posted this street at 20. It's in Eugene, Oregon, and the speeds aren't much above that. And again, the streets above, that's a Florida scene. It's just obscene the speeds that get created. With Kevin Lynch's Image of the City, his taxonomy includes, I guess, Victor, this would be kind of an LA, wouldn't it? That it's amazing the image we get and the feeling we get living in the homes along this pathway, and the great map that gets created about taking us places that the green informs, right? And I think it's also important, this is actually the same general area, that if we want pedestrians and bicyclists to feel invited and comfortable, we need that buffer, we need that separation. And I think what is being stated here is we must use the view that unless we can show that the green treatment is not needed, then it should just be a core element of what we provide to a great street. So a little more on the enclosure that street trees create. We can sense how important, first of all, the placement of the buildings is, but in this case, what we're really doing to control the speed of traffic and to create that sense of place is the beautiful edge and that sense of enclosure through both the canopies and then the nice wall or line of streets that is created. And we do this very similarly, but with different degrees, whether we're doing a main street or a neighborhood street. And we'll get into that when we get into the locations portion. Now let's talk about the patterns and the types. And I want to start with the canopy form. Victor has beautifully pointed out the best of the canopies and shapes, but it's just one of 4 forms that I'm going to feature here. And a landscape architect or a planner can select the form that they want to create the effect that they want. Beautiful form here. And again, notice the richness of this combination of treatments. Next comes the flowering tree form. This can be very effective as gateways or on corners or entire lines of a street, as you see in these scenes here. Next comes the Parkway form. It's a very different form and includes small trees. It could be a mix of trees and achieve vertical height. And notice in this case, the trees are behind the sidewalk. A number of treatments, but it's a very profound edge. These columnar trees, though, are at the street edge and create a very different visual effect. This again would be what Victor points out, the alley, correct? It shapes a beautiful feeling where the trees are on each side of the multi-use path in this case. I've come up with some photos that I would say, first of all, that it's amazing that the landscape architects were able to find out of the minimal space they were given, a way to create that edge, that buffer, that feeling. But they've done this with very linear type of breathing space and moisture penetration with these. And I believe these are still doing quite well. I took this over 20 years ago. This is Ann Arbor. Now let's talk about the location and how we apply street trees in local streets, collector, commercial, and then main streets. And I want to start with the local, since they certainly give us the greatest opportunity and once mature, in this case, wonderful buffer from the sidewalk to the street edge. And indeed, this street is designed so well that the water just flows off the street, no curbing, no additional piping. There are different parts, and I want to emphasize the role of the tree in the different parts is very distinct and unique. Obviously, note the trees framing the corners of the street as well as the center, mini circle in this case. You can see the linear treatment both from up in the air. This is the same street at grade. Just wanted to show the application and the contrast here. The use of rain gardens, a way to bring the water off the street and not only to nurture the plant life, but to handle streets and places in the Seattle area where this was done. The combination of different tree types and how much this little median treatment really helps control the speed and announce that you're now in a very different place than you were before. And we can also create a very natural look with trees. This would actually be another type, I think. In Seaside, Florida, they've done a beautiful job keeping those streets extraordinarily low So much so that it's very comfortable. The pedestrians dominate the street as opposed to cars or speed. The next category of streets is, again, a very significant percentage of all our street types, the collector, where we are piping the local streets into to now deliver all forms of traffic to destinations where our transit operates as well. And again, notice the triple canopy in this case. So some of the parts, when we achieve the collector correctly, one is don't make the travel lanes wider than they need to be. Give space for separation, offering bike lanes, then of course the trees, and then the setback of the sidewalks when we can. Now notice in the very lower left, the sidewalk is not set back. It's just a land constraint. But the full gateway into this community, they were able to achieve a little more separation of the sidewalk, and the planter row of trees became quite critical. Another one of my favorite streets that University Place, Washington created. Notice they've done some nice little clustering of the trees, three, then a reasonably wide space, then three more planted and so on. Very, very effective use of the trees to achieve the calming effect. And this totally refabricated not only this street when they rebuilt it, but many other of the streets in town now have been modified appropriately. This could either be a main street or a commercial boulevard because it started as a 5-lane road and was tamed. It's now inviting in infill, but notice the many elements, including the trees on the corner, which do not create a sight distance problem if we plant the right trees and the right spacing. But we're going to get into that in a little more depth when we get to the little subsection on intersections. I think it's important, though, to see how well we get this feeling of enclosure. It's not just the street trees that frame the sidewalk in this case, but also the median and how valuable the median is in the planting of trees. Moving in a little closer on the same street, a really keen sense of welcome, and again, it's that sense of enclosure that really works well. There's a very nice control, keeping all the elements that are vertical into what we're referring to as the furniture zone, as opposed to the walk talk zone. We can also enhance the greening with our buildings. I think this was done very well at Carmel by the Sea in California. They were able to keep a pretty wide sidewalk, but they also were able to keep a nice spacing of tree canopy. Or in Hawaii, Waikiki, and again, notice the very effective use of green, not just in the planter row, but in the buffer to the buildings, in this case, commercial buildings. Now for a contrast, a commercial street that lacks all the welcome for walking or biking and induces speed because they've over-focused on regional traffic movement as opposed to placemaking and people. And then a altered image showing what the street will become in time. This was in Oregon, where they converted the street. One that I feel personal involvement in, University Place. When we redesigned the street, we realized at first we're going to need to keep all 4 lanes. Later, this could come down to 2 lanes by working on the system. But this was taken in 1999. And I believe this was exactly 10 years later. You can see how nicely the triple canopy has pulled together the sense of a place, and it invited the building of the downtown commercial district or full downtown, which they had lacked before. Also in Washington State, again, various uses of trees to create a sense of place, a calming effect. Or in another Washington community where they're bringing back the traditional designs, building the building to the street. In this case, they use a fairly tight planter row, but it seems to be growing quite well. Other Main Street types now to feature. I like how trees work in all seasons. You know, they allow the light to come through when it's needed, but they still create that nice vertical separation or wall. In Vancouver, this is a neighborhood that's being reclaimed. They're taking out the old strip, and notice there the width of the sidewalk, what it will become, and where the tree placement is. I'm going to show you the completed treatment about 4 years later, I believe. Here you see it, but it's from the far side of the street. And again, notice the dual importance of first of all, the planter rows and the tree wells, and the added parking, in this case, all bringing the speeds down. You can see, again, they've applied beautiful green to both sides of the street. Inset parking can offer another way to emphasize the slowing of the street. This one is in Lake Oswego, done really well. And another way to plant the trees where they're not, in this case, taking up the walkway space. You can see it perhaps better with this design. It's one of my favorite street types is to do inset parking, certainly in commercial districts. And likewise, the side streets to be able to create a sense of arrival and the mystique and the beauty of walking down a street. Oh, these are Main Street style opportunities. One of the other important ways to allocate for the life of the street is to use tree wells in other creative ways, seen on the left, which is in Cambridge. They've used a composite material that allows hole penetration, oxygen, and moisture. I believe the scene on the right is also Cambridge. Notice they, again, rather than just big iron tree grates, they were able to use brickwork and so on to create the right levels of variation and moisture. I love rectangular, especially if we're going to have a fairly tight sidewalk. The rectangular pattern you see here still allows the 16 square feet of airspace, although they can do it in a narrower space, take up less space from the sidewalk. I also want to emphasize the role of trees in gateways, announcing the arrival of town. This is watercolor. And notice the very natural features they used here. They used native species of trees. Did a very cool treatment with this median arrival. They're bringing speeds down from about 55 or even 60 miles an hour on this route, 10A, I believe it is, and use on purpose a median with a 10-foot lane and then a hardened shoulder. So there's a bit of a recovery area if needed, but it, by a visual treatment, really holds the speed of the motors down. I think this is one of my favorite new communities being built in Florida, where they're able to take the concepts that we're talking about and again, they're allowing a very natural staging of the trees. And then as you get in beyond this intersection, a beautiful re-display of streets, but still keeping all these natural features as they go in. Gateways also can be enhanced with curb extensions and then a reasonably wide median. Notice it creates a natural chicane, but also creates this sense of arrival, that this is a place where your behavior as a motorist is to be entirely different, very successful. Seattle has created a number of guidelines. When I went on the internet to figure out what guidelines exist for tree planting, Seattle DOT has come up with some reasonable starting points and ways that they maintain the sight lines, but at the same time create the beauty, the pageantry, the slowing of speeds through use of their trees. Other gateway features, in this case done almost entirely with palms in Palm Springs, or in Olympia, again, a unique planting style, and even rural areas. In Brevard, North Carolina, I found these treatments very welcoming, inviting, and in both cases, these are collector roads, so they aren't local, but they use the trees to really bring the speeds down and to create an invitation. And likewise, this is a wonderful gradient. I want to say this is over half a mile long and invites people in from an area around Mobile, Alabama. And again, a fairly nice blending of trees and so on. I wanted to close out this particular section by talking about the mistakes made. I know that's one of the questions. We need a whole presentation just on how to properly maintain trees, but this one is definitely not, where we didn't work that closely with the public utilities, and they just butchered this street. Very sad when we see things like that. I know we've all seen that. Trees at intersections. This is one that I really want to cover. First and foremost, the rules were written by engineers that you have to set back trees. I wanted to show that even big trees, as long as the spacing is reasonable, allows a fairly decent sight distance. I'm going to add that I feel that the proper use of trees at intersections, and keeping in mind the sight triangle is very important for safety, but they add more safety if we do it right. Again, even when these trees mature, they're not likely to create any type of a visual impairment to the motorist, and the calming effect, the slowing effect of the trees will be far more dramatic and purposed than anything else we might do. There are numbers of diagrams of what areas the engineers prefer that we keep open. I would say, one, it's not right that we do pay attention to the intersections. We make sure we don't put in the wrong species, or in a way, notice the trees on the lower right. That's a decent setback. And one thing they've done on this street is I showed this earlier, they've put in 3 trees and then they keep a space and so on. I drive this road a lot and I find it's very, very enjoyable, and I don't ever have a problem with the trees creating a visual sightline issue. Likewise, notice it's the cars parked too close to an intersection that create far more sight issues than the trees that when we properly design a street, that we are able to cover that. Likewise, and here's an area I think we could do more research. A proper alignment of street trees screen out the non-essential information and give more emphasis to the motorist of those things that are important. If I were driving down a street like this, I would want to know when a car is coming in And I think the trees help create that emphasis, as opposed to if there were no trees here, it would just be too much visual soup to deal with. And again, notice the beautiful size of these trees, and that the sight lines are actually very open to give the person the information that they need. What I want to really emphasize is that when we're dealing with the site triangles, we need to create the right level of protection of the site triangles, but don't over-regulate it and create things that just aren't necessary. This has been pointed out in recent research. And again, I'm hopeful that we will do more and point out that the crash rates are much lower when we use street trees as part of our environment. Another benefit of greening the street is that then the signs and any other operational controls we put in are easier to see than if we're just looking at a blank sky. We can see that here, we can see it here. So having the backdrop of good trees helps us put more emphasis on the operational controls. And again, notice these trees are featured clear on up almost to the intersection. We can also use trees when we're trying to calm the speed of traffic. And notice a very effective treatment here. I totally love putting trees as well as ground cover in any curb extension. We've done it really well here. And this is just referred to as a modified T with that treatment. Likewise, you can see a project we worked on in Hawaii where getting in the crossing islands and with the median nose and so on. And again, the value of putting the trees in the raised features to a street. This helps motorists identify, makes it far less likely that they would end up hitting an object. So I'm a strong proponent of putting them in. Watching the time a little bit, but I want to cover 2 more sections fairly quickly. And again, I will go through these with a reasonable attention on the amount of time we have. We want to leave plenty of time for sharing. Trees are really important in parking lots, again, to mitigate for the horrendous effects of overparking our cities. I would recommend guidance of 15 to 25%. And where the shade, where the trees come in is, I think, is quite important. Creating that natural protection and buffer for the pedestrian, a way to get to the key destinations of the buildings set back, and just an overall greening effect for a person walking along an area, or help enhance the buildings. And in some cases, actually many cases, we can create a proper placement of trees to keep the maximum width of the sidewalk, and that's necessary when we use on-street parking. And then finally, I want to cover some of the steps that planners can take in our communities to get the right levels of tree plantings in. Again, where trees get planted, how new projects pick up on trees. I did find Seattle has some of the better planning details out there. So I recommend going to check out Seattle's planning guidelines. And again, to focus on devoting an appropriate level of investment in trees in our future of our cities. The trees and tree canopies that we're calling for more and more are going to come back to yield many times over what the investments cover. So to set a planning goal, and Guelph Ontario has it's another place I recommend turning to. They've got some pretty good guidance, and they've got an action step. One of my recommendations to many communities I visit is start your own local tree nursery, and do this for the planting of the street trees. It's almost every community I've ever worked in has available land. Volunteers love to come out and work on the nursery, and be able to come up with ways that we can power up long-term planning. A great friend of mine, Peter Lagerway, took his entire block, worked with his neighbors, and he planted, I think it was over 24 trees to really enliven his block. This is probably 12 to 15 years after the initial planting. Peter worked with each neighbor using their garden hoses to make sure the trees got nurtured and watered appropriately in the early years. And that's it. And I hope I've given us enough time, Michael and John, to have a number of questions. Yep. Do I need to do anything to turn my system off?
You can turn on your camera. I think Victor
Okay.
already has turned on his. And I want to make sure that I have it. Yeah, you're still muted, Victor. I might have tried to unmute myself and pushed your mute button.
Okay. Am I unmuted now?
You are, yes. And Victor
Okay.
still, yeah, there's Victor.
Right.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you both, by the way. I know it's already 2:20 and we have probably almost 100 questions in the queue. So I just wanted to, because I know with JP not being here, both of you amended your presentations a little bit to cover some of the ground that he was going to talk about. So I think we have a couple options here. We could go to maybe 2:45 or 3 Eastern, if that works for you, either one, or we could possibly also send you the questions after some of these and then record a separate Q&A with you.
At service.
Okay, well, let's just dive in, and I know more questions are coming in as I'm talking because the question I had on my screen has already scrolled away. Okay. Well, this is excellent, by the way, based on the audience and the preliminary ratings we're getting. It looks like this is very much resonating with the folks here, and we still have 900 people with us. Okay, so I'll start with this one from Joseph Lindsay, who asks, can you offer any advice on any strategic approaches to changing a town's philosophy about just allowing trees in the right-of-way when that's never been an option because of engineering and public works concerns and issues that have been deemed to be more important?
Victor?
I'll jump on that. I talked a lot about how much we learned from the process of going out and researching it so we could write things down in a book. Well, one of the things that happened was we ended up with 500 pictures in that book. And I gradually realized a couple of years after we published it that it had become a subversive tool, that people were using those pictures to go to that fateful meeting with their public works director or the TOT. And they were sliding the book across the conference table and pointing to one of the pictures and saying, why can't we have a street like that in our town? And I began to realize that what people need are visual examples. If it exists in the real world, you take a photograph of it, like all those beautiful pictures Dan showed, then we know it can in fact be done. And so I think the most powerful thing is pictures. Get together a good set of photos that show what you're proposing is not so outlandish. In fact, you probably can take them in the historic part of your own town or region. And when people still had the good habits, they were doing these things routinely.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, when it comes to what people really want, what they value, and the value of their homes, street trees bring that more quickly than anything else, that we can bring the speeds down in a fairly dramatic way by just, in some cases, we can build a same neighborhood, same time, one with trees, one without. And I've got examples of that. And the difference in speed is 10 to 15 miles an hour. And the value of the homes is like $10 to $15,000 more immediately in the street with the trees. So same homes, same neighborhood. The trees bring that much added value. Now that should resonate also with the cities, who obviously are interested in a firm tax base, a valuation of the homes that more than covers the cost of the trees, far more. So safer and more economically beneficial. And of course, the health aspect. Everything we want is enhanced with trees.
Dan, you reminded me, I showed a couple of pictures from Coral Gables here in South Florida where we're located. Coral Gables, these days, a Tony suburb where people pay extra because they want to be there so badly with its beautiful tree canopy and so on. They maintain 3 full-time urban forestry crews going around the city, constantly working on the street tree canopy and planting new ones and so on, adding thousands of new trees every decade. And people wonder, well, how can they afford that? And the answer is they actually have one of the lowest tax rates in the region. But the fact is the tax base is so strong and robust because of the attention that was paid all those years ago to building a green city. And so, it more than pays for itself.
Great, thank you. We'll just keep plowing through these. Next question is from Andrew Piper, who asks, do you have any advice about replanting trees back in spaces where older trees had to be removed, especially if the desire is to increase diversity of species?
Boy, I wish we had JP. He was going to cover this topic so well. I have to shy away from technical questions about how to do something other than that it's important. Victor, do you have any insights on this?
Well, folks do become concerned. They'll look at your photos or my photographs and they'll see lines of the same street tree species and wonder, is that a monoculture that's especially vulnerable to a bug or a blight or some sort of problem that affects that species? And rightly, they advocate for more variety. And the answer is not necessarily to try to go for maximum variety on just that one street. After all, where there's no repetition at all, there's none of that ordering that Dan and I spoke about. But you have a lot of streets, and if you have a traditional walkable neighborhood, you have an interconnected network of walkable streets. So you can vary the species by street, not necessarily try to plant 10 species down one block face. Now, that said, it is design. And as my friend John likes to say, in design, there are no real absolutes. And so everywhere we go, there's that exceptional tree that doesn't match up with the ones that were planted, 50 years earlier. And it might be a flowering tree, or it might be a different shaped canopy and varieties of spice of life. And I say the world did not come to an end.
Great, thanks, Victor. Our next question here is from Todd Barker, who asks, what are your suggestions for working with utilities, especially overhead utilities, to get their cooperation at adding trees to existing auto-dominated road segments?
This is where I feel we need the right kind of guidelines for utility companies and get them to adopt it. But I've seen beautiful treatments where the right type of wiring going through the right spread of canopies allows and of course the right species of trees being planted in the first place. I've seen this with many different types of trees, but there's some trees where it just wouldn't work. Victor, you've probably had more experience with this.
No, I agree. I think there's a mantra that we often hear about right tree, right place. And that's not wrong. That's correct. For example, a row of ornamentals or understory trees, beautiful flowering dogwoods or what have you, that are low enough and they're never going to grow so high as to interfere with the wires above, can be a great solution. But that said, the mantra right tree, right place is also used as an excuse for not really planting any serious canopy trees anywhere, because they're complaining about the interference of the wires on one side of the street, like you beautifully showed. And then they'll complain about the oak trees tearing up the sidewalk on the other side of the street. And before you know it, there's really no room for those pesky mature trees whose canopies will intersect and who will form a ceiling over the street. So I would say balance in all things. It should be investigated whether there might be the possibility of relocating some of these overhead wires. It's super expensive to put them below ground, not impossible, and easier with some types of wires than others. But years ago, we discovered that relocating the overhead wires to the rear lot line and the alley instead of in the street allowed us to plant the trees and cost 1/12 as much as burying the wires. So it was definitely the right call, given there was never going to be enough money to put them underground in that situation.
Okay, thank you. The next question here is to Dan from Amy Zhang, who's asking, Dan, do you know of any research or study that shows that trees help to reduce the operating speed of vehicles?
Yes, we have some good effects from a Toronto study. I can make sure I cover that, some of the links, and some other recent studies that have been done that show what the reduced speeds are. But my personal experience is, and I do this a lot, is I try to find comparison streets where I will follow motors down a road and assess their speed. And then I've found some cases where I can follow the same motors into a section without trees, and I see their speeds almost uniformly going up 10, even 15 miles per hour. So we need more observations like that, and I think we need them in each community. When I go in and do my pre-work in a community, I try to do a little bit of that assessment so I can say, look, this is your Elm Street, whatever. Here's the section that you didn't do, and these are the speeds I recorded. And I think anyone can do that and should do that to find the comparisons in their own community. But yes, we need more national studies that affirm this. We just haven't, as a nation, we haven't done the right research to build the right kinds of streets and produce the results that we need to confirm with our engineers that they need to change their guidelines or their practice. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Dan. The next question here is from Matt Wasji, who's asking, how do you plant more trees but prevent green gentrification and displacement?
Victor, have you had experience with that? By the way, I think everyone on this this webinar knows we have way under planted trees in low-income neighborhoods. Sad. I mean, it's just really sad how marginal our plantings have been in our most needful communities. But I would say that needs to be part of the budgeting in the future, and just an emphasis that we're going to green all areas to help bring them back. What would you add to that, Vic?
Well, I want to echo it. I think we found that one blatant form of environmental injustice has been the absence of tree canopy in traditionally low-income and minority communities. And remember, so if your neighborhood is operating with the tax base suppressed because property values have been low because of those systemic historic problems like redlining and neglect, and slash and burn, slum clearance, urban renewal having failed us so dramatically as well, then you're operating in an economic crater, and trying to work to lift that back to balance is the right move. It's the excessive overdoing it that is bringing out the concern about displacement. And I will say displacement rather than green gentrification, because I think that's just a little bit of lightning rod. What I am saying to you is, if you have an environmental injustice in your community in which instances of asthma, for example, are higher than they should be, and all kinds of early childhood diseases and reduced life expectancy are directly relatable to things like the absence of a street tree canopy. Fixing that is not causing green gentrification. Now, what you want to do is fix it and also have a strategy for ending up after progress with a mixed income community in which the displacement is what you're fighting to avoid, not the restoration of value or wealth creation for the households.
Great, thanks, Victor. Next one is from Patty McGrath, who asks, I noticed a photo that appeared to have a line of Bradford pear trees. How can we emphasize the role of native trees and vegetation to support ecosystems health?
Oh
Damn,
my
when I
gosh.
saw that slide, I knew they were going to ask you that.
Yeah, I think that's the one tree that almost any landscape architect says is now proven to be a mistake. They break off in moderate winds even, and they create so many maintenance issues. I hope that we can emphasize what the most desired tree species are by region, and that one has a limited placement, certainly as street trees, right? The Bradford pear.
I showed Queens Road in Myers Park in Charlotte, North Carolina, and John Nolan ordered those trees planted. And if you think about it, 19 teens, he went out in the woods in the Piedmont in North Carolina, near there, to see what native species were growing in that difficult red clay soil. And he specified that those are the trees they should use on Queens Road. And it's interesting to me, at the time, people were not all that enthusiastic about native species. It wasn't an issue that you heard then like you would hear it now. And Nolan was that forward thinking that he prescribed it. And we're all winners because he did.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. Next question here is from David Romero, who says, the uniformity of the same tree species in alleys or tree lines, I'm not quite sure, can this increase the probability of disease wiping out most of the trees, and are designers trying to include more diversity in these forms?
Yeah, I think I addressed this earlier. Yes, it does increase the vulnerability, but some of the hybrids that are popular among nurserymen and sometimes specified by landscape architects today are really recent creations, and we don't actually know how they will hold up. In some cases, we're sold on the idea that they are somehow hardier than the original native versions of those species that thrived for hundreds or thousands of years. And so I hear landscape architects like Douglas Duani, for example, pretty harshly criticize the hybrid selections and say, go for the real thing. You'll end up with more storm worthiness or hardiness against blight and bugs. But yes, that's an issue. So think about it. You have a whole pattern of a network of blocks and streets. Don't do every single street in the same species. The Olmsted brothers and their plans for Lake Wales, Florida, we're looking at their 1930 plans. They specified a unique tree for each of several streets and then repeated the pattern, specifying sometimes a tree canopy and placement that would cause the crowns to intersect, sometimes specifying palm trees that would have that effect. And they were looking for visual variety, but what they were also doing in the process was creating a resilience against a blight like the Dutch elm disease.
Great, thanks, Victor. Next one here is from Kyle Benjamin, who says, on roads where there's a limited right-of-way to fit sidewalks, trees, and other amenities, would you propose that it's more important to build the sidewalk or plant the trees?
Well, it depends on the street location type and so on. I live on a street where we don't have sidewalks. We just can't. We're on too much of a slope. And by focusing on getting the street speeds low, we get high volumes of people walking and biking, and resultantly they become part of the feature that keeps the speeds low. But I would say take the space out of the street first and see if you can get in the planter row. And I would rather see, say, a basic 5-foot sidewalk, certainly on local streets, and even as little as a 3-foot wide planter row rather than an 8-foot wide sidewalk attached to the curb. I just know that's more comfortable, and it's a better overall design of the street. So it's a case by case basis, but I would start by taking the excess width out of the street. Most of our streets are built with the wrong guidance, which induces the speed. Take that added width out of the lanes first. Yeah.
I say don't start with the center line. If you start with the center line and work your way out in a cross-section drawing, you're starting with the car stuff most of the time. Maybe not on the Rambla in Barcelona, but most of the time you're starting with car stuff, and you're adding in all the car stuff and truck stuff and garbage truck stuff and moving van stuff and parking and so forth. And then you get to the edges of your drawing paper and you realize you don't have any room left for things like street trees and sidewalks or bike infrastructure. And the answer is start with humans. The people space is the first thing to incorporate in the right of way that is allowed, that is available, and work your way to the car stuff and accommodate the car to the extent that you can with the room that you have. That is a fundamental reorienting of 75 years of transportation engineering practice that I'm recommending to all my friends, the transportation engineers. But I think we learned, for example, how much progress could be made when the city of Chicago reoriented their diagram to put pedestrians at the top of the pyramid, followed by cyclists, and down the list after those are taken care of and landscape is taken care of, room for cars and freight and transit and so on. So if you start with the vehicle stuff, you're always going to run out of room.
Thanks, Victor. Next one here is from Henry Reed, who says, from the perspective of a very small community with no existing street tree program, how can the labor costs of a planting and care program be estimated?
Again, I wish JP were here.
I think we should give JP's email address out at this point. I don't know yet.
I think we should. Wish him well, folks. He just became diagnosed with COVID, and he's needing lots of care. That just happened this morning. I don't know if I have the technical answer to this question. So.
Okay, well, we'll go ahead and share that with him. And then there's also the option of reaching out to him directly. We'll make that available as well.
Yeah.
Okay, well, just to move on with the questions in the time we have, here's one from Kim Struthers, which is, what advice do you have on how to get the public works and street department staff on board? We planners have such a hard time getting past their concerns about tree roots lifting sidewalks and curbs and other maintenance concerns.
Well, let me start. The type of species and the way you plant has far more to deal with the maintenance issues that might later arise. I've worked on many sidewalks that the streets are easily 50, 60, 70, 80 years old before there's any type of uplifting. And if they were planted with the right selection of species and with the right consideration, then you don't get the encroachment either in the street or in the sidewalk. And think about it, we rebuild streets often as often as every 12 years. A sidewalk can be reshaped when needed 60, 70, 80 years later. Yeah. Victor, what would you?
Root barriers are a technique, just thinking ahead about what the tree is actually going to need. Dan showed some planting areas that were larger than the old 1960s tree grate tree well. And now we have a whole range of tools for making sure the roots have somewhere to go. And in a lot of our species, especially in the Sun Belt, we have trees that are looking with shallow hair-like roots right below the surface for sunlight and oxygen, not just for water. So those are really big, important culprits that if they don't have somewhere to go, that affects the tree's health. If the only place they have to go is to uproot the sidewalks, that can tend to happen. So just knowing the street tree species is important. Now, in our office, we work all over the country. So we get with a local landscape architect who really knows what the trees do when they plant and grow and can specify the planting detail that makes sense for that place. And that I think is important. For a root barrier, sometimes after all, this is urban street trees we're talking about. There's some place where you really don't want a root to go. You can direct it. So that's what happens is budget decisions are going along and the money's always tight. And someone says, well, we have to cut these street trees out. We'll plant them later. So they'll do all the hard stuff and concrete and say, future budget year, we'll come back and put the trees in. Oh, and since we're going to put the trees in later, we'll take the root barrier out of the budget as well. Guaranteed, however many years down the line, they come back and they put the tree in, they don't put the root barrier in at the same time. And then, so that's the sort of mistake that is all too common. Last, your question was about how to get public works departments or the like to do the right thing. Well, the answer is, of course, that they report to the elected officials. There's a time-honored principle in management: keep your boss's boss off your boss's back. Educate your elected officials. Walking tours, like the ones Dan often gives, where the elected officials are standing there with citizens seeing the real results in a real place, good or bad, get translated into direction for your city manager or administration or your mayor. And that public works staff is going to be looking to keep them happy. If they're all standing there in the same walking tour, everybody learns. Yeah. But they'll learn from nothing as well as they will learn from hearing the mayor or the city council member or the alderman, common council member say, I see it now and that's what I want. I want those street trees. Believe me, you will get more change that way than running up and down the hallway, knocking on cubicles.
Thanks, Victor. Great advice. Next question here is from Jessica Bradshaw, who asks, minimum planting widths and soil volumes imposed by jurisdictions limit design alternatives that are shown in many of the slides. Do these designs use modular suspended pavement systems?
Some of them. I showed a couple of streets that do have structural soil or green blue urban or the comparable below grade suspension strategies in order to give those roots somewhere to go. Those are also a great stormwater management tool in places where we have a lot of water to deal with in the big events. So, of course, the drainage is one of the most important features of a street design and one of the most expensive parts. And nobody really appreciates all the money that you put into it because it's below ground. But those suspended systems are part of the stormwater management strategy. So they have another way of paying back for the result. But yes, those are used in some of the examples that I showed, not all of them.
Great, thanks, Victor. Next question here is from Emma Perez, who says, it's difficult to overlook the challenge that above ground power lines present to trees. The trees in my neighborhood in Silver Spring, Maryland, where there's proximity to power lines, the crowns in the mature trees were severely cut to make room for the lines. What solutions have you encountered that allow for planting and, even more importantly, keeping trees where above power lines exist?
Again, the way that we plant the trees, the species we select, and knowing what the utility needs are is really important. I think sometimes we overlook that. So a good close coordination with the utilities companies is quite important. And by the way, the problem with street trees for the utility companies isn't just above ground, it's below ground. So a full toolkit is needed, and real close collaboration, I think, is going to help a lot. The trees are important, but so are the utilities. And there are ways to treat utilities that are a good partnership with the type of street trees that are appropriate for a neighborhood. Yeah.
Lots of communities have received assistance, either post-storm assistance with FEMA and so forth, or infrastructure investments where the state or the federal government are supporting them, and they're hardening the grid. That's a phrase you hear a lot, hardening the grid, basically to make it less likely to cause your neighborhood to lose power the next time snow or wind or ice make branches fall. And so when they're hardening the grid, they're going back out and they're restringing lines. They're changing the curvatures of the hanging wires. They're changing the connections to the poles. And all of those are times when they're out there working on it anyway. So if someone is coordinating, like your urban forester or the chief of urban design in your city is working with them in a partnership way, the collaboration Dan suggests, you could probably look up and say, why are there 5 lines here? And when over there were only 3. And why are they so far apart? Is that just because that's the way it was done over many years when they accumulated? And when we're restringing them and hardening the grid, can we push them up? Can we put them closer together? These are going to be ways that you can make even the ornamentals below wires more successful over the longer term.
Great, thanks, Victor. Just looking through these questions, given the time we have, we'll probably ask a few more and then wrap up here. Next one is from Edward Demore, who asks, do you recommend that all street trees have their lowest branches at no lower than 6 feet? I've seen communities that don't specify this and they get trees that have branches that scratch parked cars and threaten to take your eye out as you walk down the sidewalk.
Well, I know that's really important, that especially at intersections, that we maintain that site triangle. And so it's important not to have big branches to where they're going to intrude on any need, but especially the visual treatment. We again should be careful about the species that we select, and then making sure that we do a proper trimming. And that's not just on the side streets coming in, but it's also the medians as well. We must maintain the sight lines. 6 feet will work for most vehicles, and the drivers of large semis and so on also need to be accommodated, but not overly accommodated. I wouldn't under trim too much. Yeah.
Dan, you're as tall as I am, so you know that 6 feet is going to get you across the forehead right about here if you're on the sidewalk. So what I would say is, you need more clear trunk height on Main Street, for example, where so on a Main Street redesign, we will work with the landscape architect to select the spec. It's usually something well in excess of 6 feet of clear trunk height. This is, of course, pushing you toward installing older trees, more mature trees that have been cultivated in the nursery and now are transplanted later in their life. And that there's a downside to that. They recover more slowly from the transplant. They grow more slowly. They are less strong, live less long. If you can plant smaller ones and wait, you'll be happier with the longest of long-term results. But that might not get you the tree that's substantial enough for the ribbon cutting with clear trunk height for you to walk through. So even at the time of transplanting, when they're limbed up and pruned and root pruned prior to planting, you've got to be thinking about how much clear trunk height you can live with.
Thank you. Next question here is, I've noticed in some of the photos presented had different types of street lights depending on the size of the trees and the width of the street. Do you have any comments about how street lighting can complement the street tree design?
I'll start. Pedestrian scale lamps are often interspaced appropriately between the trees, and done well and with the right type of fixtures from the lamps, we're able to create an even more wonderful evening scene. Trees and lamps complement one another beautifully, but they also have to be coordinated. They can't compete with one another, or we certainly don't want the street trees to block the value of the lamps. When we get to a main street, it's critical importance to get that right balance and not have the overhead big, tall cobras that create the shadow effects. There's just so many ways that we can bring together a better partnership between lamps and street trees. Victor?
Line them up. I mean, because when the street trees are young, like in the oldest picture of University area, Dan, that you showed,
Mhm.
you can tell that they're there, but they're not that substantial in your field of vision. Years later, a decade later, they really are.
Yeah.
But on day one, the lampposts, when they switch on at dusk, are going to be very noticeable. And if they go all over the place and there's 3 out of place and then it bounces back, you really see it. So this is one of the places where the designer needs to get a really long T-square and line them up, draw a line in a really strong, long, straight line, and wherever possible, line up the lampposts, because they'll be noticeable right in the beginning.
Great, thanks. We'll just ask a couple more and then we'll wrap up. And I don't know if this is a question that would be best answered by JP, but I'll try it. And if so, we'll send it on to him. And that is, as we discuss the benefits of street trees, what are the pros and cons to planting fruit-bearing trees? Organized placement and designing fruit-bearing trees in the future development can introduce innovations in sustainable urban agriculture and resolve issues of food scarcity.
Can I
Well,
jump on that one, Dan?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, first, I mean, the pros are obvious. It's part of a food forest, and it's one more strategy for making a higher quality of life in the neighborhood. And it's also possible that if you grow mangoes all the way down your street, that they're going to drop some really sticky mess all over the place. And so really what it comes down to is the culture of maintenance that's going to have to be more than what City Hall funds and sends a crew out to do. If it's in your place, it's the local cultural tradition that people look after the tree lawn in front of their lot, then and they'll look after the tree, or a neighborhood group get together and do it, pay for professional pruning maintenance as a group. Then there's less concern, right? And so it all comes down to, do you have that culture? Can you grow that culture? There's a beautiful neighborhood in Davis, California, called Village Homes, where Mike and Davis and Judy Corbett installed fruit-bearing trees along the walkways. And the folks in the community get together for their potluck dinners in the common spaces. They walk down those walkways. And the food forest has been part of the life in that neighborhood from the beginning. So one of the first things a realtor would show you when showing you a home in that community. So done well, more pros than cons. What do you say, Dan?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, Village Homes is one of the most sterling examples. People love to take the walks and pick the fruit, whatever's in season. But I'll add to that fragrance gardens. Trees put up beautiful fragrances if properly selected. And there are a number of trails now, especially in Arizona, that Betty Drake features in her creation of trails, where fragrances are the whole experience. And you can have different fragrances by season. People will come back to some of the great parks in Arizona just to experience the fragrances of the season. And so, yeah, an edible trail and a fragrance trail, both have huge benefit to a community.
Well, fruit trees are flowering trees. And so it also means you're reinforcing the flyways for pollinators by incorporating fragrance and fruit.
Exactly.
Okay, well, let me ask you one more before we wrap with your closing thoughts. And this one's from Chloe Ritter, who asks, I agree that street trees between a sidewalk and path and a road provide an important buffer from traffic. But what strategies are effective at pushing back against traffic engineering standards that call for tree-free clear zones?
Well, first point I'd like to make is that if you get the speed designated and designed for along a street, the trees become an important part of keeping those speeds low. And the lower the speeds that you seek, the closer the planting of the trees can be, along with modern curbing or other features, swales, that we just have to get the total street designed correctly. And then streets become not just a potential problem, they become the solution.
Exactly what I would have said.
Right. Well, as usual, we could go another 45 minutes with more questions, and we will send all the questions to Victor and Dan. But we would love to kind of wrap up here and thank everybody for being here. But before we end, I just want to give each of our speakers a chance for some closing thoughts. And why don't we start with Dan today?
Yeah. Well, first of all, this is one of the greatest treats in my career is to present with Victor. He's been a mentor of mine throughout my life, and I hope I've helped contribute or added some detail, Victor, and not just revisit the same theme. But I think the important thing is we now know that we should have always been planning our towns, cities, parks, streets, everything with street trees. And because streets in America dominate the amount of paved areas and the other harmful effects that come with the paving, we should be just going every which way we can to get the right trees, the right placement on every type of street we build. Same with the parking lots. There should no longer be guidelines that leave trees out of the most basic street typology. They're just so essential. So I love the fact that we've got such great participation on this topic today, and thank you too to Michael and John for orchestrating this. This is magical. Thank you.
My closing thought is similar, which is I'm really grateful to see this much attention being paid to the topic. All these people signing up and coming to this webinar gives me a priceless kind of encouragement, because we never know. Are we getting through with the things Dan and I are waving the flag about here? Street trees, worth the effort. It isn't the same everywhere. I mean, and if you're in a high desert environment, you might have to do things with architecture. You know, in, I don't know, Chico or Santa Fe, you may need to do things with the building forms to get shade on the sidewalk. Because waiting for the tree to grow is not a strategy, or planning on all that irrigation is not something you can do on every street. So there are exceptions for every rule. There are places in very cold climates where the winter sun is so precious that we don't want to interfere with it in any way. So there are some places in the frozen north, which for the Floridians, we all think it starts at about the Fort Lauderdale, Miami border and goes up. No, I mean the really frozen north. There may be places where you have to be strategic about where you plant trees, either because there's not enough water or there's not enough winter sun. But those are the exceptions. And most of us live in places where the street trees are not only the tradition, but they're also essential, absolutely worth the effort.
Great. Thank you very much, Victor. And thanks, Dan, for being with us. And thanks to Dan for organizing this one with Victor. And sorry that JP wasn't able to visit with us today, but hopefully he'll be feeling better soon. And with that, we're going to conclude our webinar today, The Essential Value of Street Trees in City Making and Sustainable Urban Design. I'd like to offer an enormous thank you to Dan Burden and Victor Dover for a great presentation, to everyone who attended today, and to John Coleman, our communications and technology guru, who helps to make this all happen every single time. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org. Also, for those of you who have requested one, all attendees will receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation. Please look for this follow-up email if you need the certificate to claim other continuing education credits. When you exit from today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. And finally, keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and your email inbox for details on other future webinars, including our 2 October Walk-in-Hour programs, Walking in Public Health, Research Insights into the Value of Active Living, which will be this Thursday morning, and next week's final Walktober, Expanding Access to Pedestrian Infrastructure and Improving Public Safety, Tools and Case Studies, which will be on October 27th. With that, I wish everyone a great day.